Kia ora koutou, I'm Lockie Patterson. In 1901, Rewiti Kōhere, Anglican clergyman and editor of the Māori language newspaper Te Pipi Wharaurua, wrote the following words about a group of Indian troops then visiting New Zealand. Although they are quite a different race, it is on account of us having one rule and one flag that is fought under, the flag of our Queen, who has been taken from us, ours and their Queen, that we are close to them. So, what does all this mean? To understand Kōhere's statement, as well as the following video, we need a wee bit of context first. And why did Indian soldiers visit New Zealand in 1901? And what were Kōhere's own experiences of this? And then ask the question again, what does it all mean? On January the 1st, 1901, the colonies of Australia had come together as a commonwealth, as a single nation. Queen Victoria died later in the month. At this time too, the British Army, assisted by the white colonies of the Empire, were still fighting against the Boers in South Africa. Now, with regard to the Commonwealth, New Zealand was invited to join, and we even sent some people over to Australia to check it all out. But in the end, decided, nah. One reason was the issue of Māori rights. Despite Māori suffering from land loss, cultural oppression, and social and political marginalisation, they did have voting rights in New Zealand and had gained a sense of equal status under the Treaty of Waitangi. But pretty much white New Zealand suffered from a sort of cognitive dissonance where they restrained any Māori activities or aspirations that might hold back Pākehā ascendancy or economic progress, but at the same time claimed Māori as the highest form of native people as befitted the best colony of the empire. We can see from this cartoon in which Zealandia is rebuffing the Australian invitation, supposedly protecting Māori from the Australian ogre. However, both Australia and New Zealand pursued a white immigration policy. So another reason New Zealand rejected the Australian offer was they weren't sure that the northern parts of the continent were suitable for white settlement and would inevitably be populated by non-white immigrants who might then migrate to New Zealand, something they didn't want. So we didn't become part of the Commonwealth of Australia. But New Zealand definitely had a presence at the big celebrations on the 1st of January in 1901, with the Premier, Richard Seddon, the Native Minister, James Carroll, accompanied by 3 influential Māori chiefs and others, all attending in Sydney. Now, this was not just the birth of a new nation, but also a huge event within the British Empire. A sizable imperial force, that is, British Army, were also present. There were representatives of various regiments of the Indian Army and a small military contingent from New Zealand, which included some Māori soldiers. It was all very grand, lots of marching, drills and pomp and smart colourful uniforms. And Seddon decided that it would be marvellous to have these Imperial and Indian troops also come and visit New Zealand. And a 25-day tour was hastily arranged, starting in Auckland and then calling in at various ports down the country to Bluff, with a side trip, of course, to Rotorua, one of New Zealand's premier tourist attractions. The Indian officers in their sumptuous uniforms were incredibly popular, with crowds flocking to see them. And one Auckland theatre even advertised a show stating that some of the officers were going to be in the audience. So they were treated a little bit like rock stars. And as one newspaper reported, in Timaru, a mania for handshaking took possession of the crowd of spectators, especially the feminine element. While passing along the street, the Indian troops trailed their hands to touch them as they passed. And at the train station, the track was lined with people for some distance, and they held up their hands to be stroked by the departing visitors. really popular. This was in a country that desperately tried to keep race aliens, like Indians, from settling here. They were considered undesirable, a racial and economic threat, and whose religions were considered idolatrous, superstitious and cruel. But New Zealanders had several strands to their identity. On one hand, they were very proud of the better Britain that white settlers were creating in the South Pacific, but they were also very loyal and enthusiastic supporters of the British Empire. They were therefore prepared to celebrate the Indian troops on that basis, as co-members of a larger imperial family of races, albeit governed by white colonial rulers. Few questioned this. Only the Otago Witness, quoting the London Spectator, doubted that Indians might feel the same way, and that they saw the empire as a temporary blip. And as for the Indian troops, it is doubtful whether they will be found on our side in the Battle of Armageddon. Now, how New Zealanders saw the Indians tied in with Heather Street's arguments about a discourse of martial races at the time. That is, a hierarchy of race-related military braveness and prowess, in which Māori were considered to rank highly, fitted with the prevailing notions of race, as well as, quote, increasingly jingoistic, militaristic, and imperially minded popular culture. Newspapers treated their readers to descriptions of how the Indian visitors fitted into this racial order. These extracts are from Gisborne's own Poverty Bay Herald, which talked of brave Sikhs and Punjabis and Gurkhas, while disparaging others such as Bengalis, who did not match the supposed masculinity of true martial races. So for New Zealand, the troops were incredibly popular, with their presence nicely aligning with imperial sentiment and loyalties. Reports of the travelling Indians percolated around the country. Great excitement grew, especially in places on their schedule, like Gisborne. Now, what was Gisborne like in 1901? Well, nothing like it is now. Although it was the major centre in the Poverty Bay district, there were only about 2,700 people who lived in the town itself, and there were another 8,000 who lived in the neighbouring Cook County, of whom just over a quarter were Māori. So, a rather small place in today's terms, but not unusual for the time. But the people of Gisborne were planning a big day for their esteemed visitors. Due to the Indians' dietary restrictions, they cooked for themselves, so there couldn't be a feast or a grand dinner. However, there would be a parade that would end with some entertainment in the form of a Māori cultural performance. And this wasn't unusual. Gisborne had asked local Māori to provide performances at previous events, such as when Pretoria fell, where Reweti Kōhiri had acted as an interpreter for the Ngāti Porou chief Tuta Niho Niho, and when local Māori composed a special haka to celebrate the exploits of Lord Roberts, the leading British general in the South African War. Kōhiri was asked to organise a performance for the Indians, but given he only had a few days before the event, he didn't think that a first-class haka was likely, but they would do their best. Why the enthusiasm? Well, as I said, Pākehā, despite the way they treated Māori, still claimed they were the best native race in the world. And Māori wanted to be treated fairly, as equal citizens. By being enthusiastic supporters of empire, they were aligning themselves with mainstream sentiments. This wasn't the case for all Māori, of course. But for iwi such as Ngāti Porou, who had fought alongside government forces during the New Zealand Wars, professions of loyalty to the king, country and empire were not unusual. Reweti Kōhiri was a reformer, part of what became known as the Young Māori Party, alongside such luminaries as Api Ranangata, Maui Pōmare and Te Rangihiroa. They were worried that Māori might disappear as a people, and they pushed for policies that would raise Māori materially, socially and spiritually as a means of racial survival. And in February 1901, Kōhiri considered that involvement in this public celebration, in which Māori culture was given its due respect, was one way of improving their status. So on the morning of the 21st of February 1901, the Dalhousie of the Royal Indian Marine Service, with its cargo of 90 officers and NCOs, steamed into Gisborne. The Premier, Seddon, Native Minister, Carroll, were there, as were local dignitaries. The Indians were greeted at the wharf and then came marching or on horseback with swords drawn in a procession through Gisborne's dusty streets to the recreation ground. It was a hot day, and the whole event was delayed for half an hour due to the Premier conducting government business at the telegraph office. The bands played as the people waited, and after the speeches were over, according to the Poverty Bay Herald, the Māori tried to get up a war dance, but it proved a fiasco. Now, what had gone wrong? Kōhiri wrote back to the paper to suggest that it was not the performers' fault. They were putting on their costumes when a committee member had told them not to perform because things were running late. Now, Kōhiri would have been particularly annoyed and slighted. He was bilingual and educated, and often acting as an intermediary between Māori and Pākehā, and channeling news to Māori through his newspaper. He had organised a performance, and this was going to be an opportunity for Māori to participate in a unique and important event. At a time when Māori occupied a marginal space in New Zealand society, the performance was their opportunity to assert in the public sphere their legitimacy as citizens of the town, country and empire. He would also have resented, as a clergyman who disapproved of gambling, of having been passed over for horse racing. It was in the Anglican Church's Māori language newspaper Te Pipi Wharaurua, of which Kōhiri was editor, that he gave a fuller account. He said they'd been pestered to perform, and it would have taken place if we'd not been tricked by one of the people of the committee. That Pākehā was in charge of the horse racing that day, and in his eagerness for people to go to the races, told us not to perform the haka. Our haka would have been good. The Indian soldiers and Colonel Dudba were very sad at not seeing the haka. So Colonel Dudba was the officer in charge of this contingent of soldiers. Despite unable to provide the cultural performance, Kōhiri's article accentuated the role of various Māori performed during the day, that the Whataupoko band had been mostly Māori, that Kuia had welcomed the Indian soldiers on the street, and that James Carroll, the native minister, was of Māori heritage. In his article, he also discussed the Indians, of course including the brilliance of their uniforms and their loyalty to the king and empire, and much of this was of a similar tone to what was appearing in the Pākehā papers. However, he appears to have got a little closer to the Indian troops than other newspaper men. He alone discussed the troops' servants, who, in comparison to their masters, were puny and ill-dressed. He also reported that Colonel Dudba would have preferred not to have been on tour, as travel didn't agree with him. Quite possibly, small provincial towns such as Gisborne, with unpaved streets and unsophisticated inhabitants, would also have held little appeal, although he was probably too polite to mention this to Kōhiri. One area where the Indians were quite different were the dietary restrictions that they observed, that they didn't eat beef or pork, and that if this tikanga custom is broken, the tapu, spiritual power of the person, is gone, and is excluded from his community and despised. Now this is written in a fairly matter-of-fact way, but Kōhiri was a Christian minister, and Te Pipi Wharaurua in the past had been quite disparaging about Indian religions, and generally supportive of any missionary work to convert the heathen to Protestant beliefs. But here he is removing the otherness of the Indians and explaining their religious beliefs with terms such as tikanga, tupuna, tapu that would have resonated with his Māori readers. He concluded his article with our first quotation, in which he seeks to show a form of unity of Māori and Indians both belonging to the family of races within the British Empire. At the end of the race meeting, the soldiers boarded the Dalhousie and sailed south so they might march through the streets of Napier the following day. It was a busy schedule for them. Now, Kōhiri no doubt saw the irony in the Pākehā citizens of Gisborne celebrating the visit of Indian troops. In his newspaper the following month, this snippet appeared, highlighting the hypocrisy of the prevailing ideas on race. Okay, so what are some other take-home points? White colonists in Australia and New Zealand had multifaceted identities. On the one hand, they were proud of the progress of their colonies, a sort of nationalism, if you like, but were also keenly loyal to the British Empire, even providing troops to fight in South Africa. They also believed that their countries should, as much as possible, restrict it to white immigrants to preserve racial purity, despite the fact that most of the people living within the empire were not white. So there are some inherent contradictions within their identities. So when Australia became a new nation in January 1901, soldiers from the British Army, from New Zealand, including Māori, and from the Indian Army were present as part of the celebrations. And New Zealand was keen to have the British and Māori soldiers tour their country as a visible and physical manifestation of their own ties to the empire. Although Māori were generally not enamoured with the colonialism they lived under, some young reformers, such as Reweti Kōhiri, sought social and political equality within New Zealand. No doubt Kōhiri had positive feelings towards the empire. This was not unusual for people of his iwi at the time, but he also relished the opportunity for Māori to play an important part in a community event, where fellow natives, the Indian officers, were being feted by Gisborne's white citizens. Fellow natives who, apart from being part of the empire's armed forces, would not have been welcome in this country. There's very little in the newspaper reports of the time about what the Indians themselves thought about travelling around New Zealand, visiting small cities and towns. Apart from Kōhiri stating that Colonel Dabha had not actually wanted to come, most papers report little except polite expressions. At the end of the day, the Indians provided a colourful spectacle that proved popular with the New Zealand public, but their visit also aligned with confident Pākehā assertion of their place within the emerging New Zealand nation and empire beyond, and with Māori attempts to position themselves as people distinct from Pākehā, yet worthy of conclusion. Now, I've published an article on this topic. It's longer, with a lot more details, including Māori interactions with both Indians and Australian Aborigines during the Commonwealth celebrations, and you'll find a link to it down below. Ngā mihi e hoa mā, ka kite anō.